In this video, I'm reviewing the Aero Kestrel Flex. This is a new saddle that Aero came out with this year in addition to their other offerings, the Kite and the Kestrel. They didn't get rid of the Kestrel, they didn't get rid of the Kite, so it's not a replacement. It's more so people that had either one of those systems would oftentimes give them feedback, hey, I'd really love it if you could add this or add that. And so what they did with the Flex is they tried to answer some of those questions and give people different options to choose from. So if they like the original Kestrel or Kite, you can still go with that option. Whereas if you like some of the newer things with the Flex, you can go with the Flex. There's really three main differences between this system and the original Kestrel. And I'll go into those in more detail, but in a nutshell, difference number one, there's no adjusters right down here. The adjustment in terms of the saddle, cupping is controlled by this Flex panel that they've added in. So it allows you to get more adjustment with this entire bottom panel to be able to pull that whole thing up underneath your thighs. The other thing that they did with this saddle is, of course, they added more camouflage patterns. So that's going to be of interest to some guys. And then the third change that they made with the Flex is more bridge options. So with the Kite and the Kestrel, you basically had a rope bridge that had a carabiner that you could clip on to your offside. And with the Flex, you now have the option of three different bridge options. You have the adjustable rope bridge, which is what I have here. You also have the options for two different webbing-based systems, one of which has a carabiner, so you can take it off, put it back on, and the other one that's a fixed position, meaning it's attached to both sides, but it still has a tri-glide so you can adjust the length. So to show you guys quick with this Lymans rope, with that auto-locking carabiner, I can go ahead, clip it in with one hand like that, it auto-locks, and then because we got this Prusik Tender here, I can go ahead and lift up with one hand to get that rope to tighten, and then to loosen, you would just grab the hitch and slowly pull it out, right? So kind of like a mechanical ascender, but this is a little bit more similar to what you'd see typically used in the tree industry. The way that it feels to me compared to if I'm just using a hitch or if I'm using a mechanical ascender, it's much easier than just using a hitch with no kind of tending device on it. I would say it's as easy as using a mechanical ascender when you don't have it loaded very heavily. So if you're using it just kind of as a Lymans rope where you're just doing this kind of thing, it doesn't really lock up that much, it's pretty fine. If you really load into it and get that hitch to bite into the rope, or if you have it hooked up in your tether, and you really set your weight into it, or if you're a bigger guy, then sometimes you got to give it a little extra force compared to a mechanical ascender, but I wouldn't say it's hard to use by any means. Now with this rope bridge, there's some advantages and disadvantages. Obviously one of the disadvantages is, of the various options that you have for your bridge, this one's probably the bulkiest and the heaviest. One of the upsides is you have a ton of adjustability in terms of the length. You can make it pretty short or obviously very long. One of the other advantages is that since it is so long, on a smaller tree like this, you can actually put it around the tree, hook it back into your harness, and then you can actually use it as kind of a temporary hookup point to be able to get your main Lymans rope past a branch and be able to keep on climbing without disconnecting. Now you can do that of course with your tether, but if I were going to use my tether at that point, essentially if I had kind of a fixed bridge, what I would have to do is go ahead and unhook that tether off of the back side of the harness, undo it, girth hitch it around the harness, throw it around and be able to use it, versus this bridge is just usually a little bit quicker and easier access because I might already have that thing just kind of draped over my shoulders ready to go, whereas the tether is going to be kind of daisy chained up on the back side of the harness. So not the end of the world if you have a webbing style bridge or any other kind of style of bridge and you're going to have to go around some branches, you can just take that tether, girth hitch it to one of your bridge loops and just kind of preparation for that when you go up the tree. But it just gives you a couple of different options based on having this rope bridge. All right, so the total weight for the Flex with that rope bridge option is 5 pounds 2 ounces. It's going to be slightly less than this if you go with the webbing bridge and the carabiner, and less yet if you go with just the fixed webbing bridge. Okay, so from here on out, I'm pretty much just gonna look side by side at the original Kestrel versus the Flex because they are the most two similar saddles out of the lineup, and just kind of explain some of the differences, both in terms of how they operate and just some of the upgrades that they made since this original Kestrel came out. And so the first thing and the most obvious thing is just the length of this fabric up here, right? So for the original Flex, you just have a fixed length and there's no stretch here. It's just basically 4 panels of this Cordura on the back side and then 4 additional panels on this side. So there's 8 total pieces there and it's fixed. Whereas with the Flex, you have your same kind of panels on the back side here of that Cordura, but then if you flip it around and look at the other side, what we've got here is basically what the inside of this would look like. So if you were to rip this Kestrel open, you'd probably see this backside of the fabric. It's just that you have another layer over the top. Whereas with this, instead of doing layer on one side, layer on the other, we just got that backside layer, and then we got the Flex panel sewn across the front here. And so when you stretch that out, you of course get that extra top to bottom distance versus that Kestrel. And you can see how that looks like stretched out here. In, out. And that's where you're getting your additional adjustment from. So I've seen a couple of people question on the forums originally, you know, this looks kind of shiny. Is that going to be noisy? You know, for me, once it's on my body, this doesn't seem to make too much noise, and it's not going to be any hotter necessarily than the Kestrel, because remember, this is on the inside of the Kestrel anyway, and walking around with this thing, I haven't noticed any noise. That being said, with this Cordura face fabric, Cordura itself is a noisy material when you rub against it, much more so than fleece or mesh, right? So when you're up on the tree, you're not rubbing up against anything, so you don't really have to worry about that noise up in the tree. The only time that would ever really come into consideration, at least in my opinion, is if you're walking through something thick enough where you have to kind of turn sideways to get through some stuff. So you really got to just think about your overall area and whether or not that would make a difference to you. Okay, so then the next thing I want to point out, and just kind of comparing one versus the other, this is obviously a very old Kestrel because you can see the molly loops here do not really have that loose spacing. It's more sewn like the, you know, the specification for that molly webbing, which is intended to be used with molly accessories. And they got basically enough feedback regarding it being tough to put accessories and carabiners into this stock molly type of webbing that they went ahead and loosened these things up. So from the perspective of being able to fit a carabiner in here, this makes it much easier to be able to fit a carabiner in. Now, if you have an old saddle that just has this real tightly sewn webbing, one thing you can actually do, if you want to be able to clip a carabiner in, just take a zip tie, make a little loop like that. And then you clip that carabiner in there super easily as well. So just something to think about if you're, you know, you have something like this and you're wondering if just that feature alone is worth it for you. That's one alternative you can do. In my opinion, if you're just going to be attaching things via carabiners, I think this makes sense. If you plan on just using dump pouches for everything, or if you need to hook a carabiner in using like a zip tie, I think something like this is fine too. It just depends on basically how you see yourself using those molly attachments. The next thing I want to go over is the alignment belt length. So the positioning of these loops, if we look at where they are, these are both size 1s. Where these loops were originally versus where they are now, you can see you got some extra length there. So these things are going to be further forward with the Kestrel Flex than they were with, you know, that older Kestrel. The other thing to note here too is that on the Kestrel, you also had this adjustment strap to be able to help that saddle cup underneath your butt a little bit more. Whereas with the Flex, they got rid of that in lieu of the fact that you can do the same type of thing by just increasing the length of that saddle top to bottom. Similar to the Kestrel, you got your quick release for both your waist buckle and you got your quick release for your leg buckle. So here's my kite. This actually didn't come stock. I bought this and added this on separate, this Raptor buckle, because I like the quick release on the waist. But basically, It came originally on that kite with a feed through here, and then you can see on the legs, you have these kind of quick release buckles, but kind of not. Basically, you would take these things and stick one through the other like that, and that's how you would connect those. Not as easy, in my opinion, as a quick release, but a little bit lighter. So what I typically did with the kite is I would just leave these connected all the time, just step through them, and then just wrap with tape, if you're really worried about the noise. In terms of the materials and how this thing's sewn together, Aero Hunter is known for being able to produce good saddles. They've been doing it for an awful long time. The quality of the stitching and everything is very good in my opinion. The only place where, just kind of in my observations, the place where I'm kind of a little bit concerned is on this actual pleat itself. I'm starting to get some fibers that are lifting up. It seems like this end of this fabric is not really sewn off to kind of end that. So it seems like this fraying could maybe continue over time. So that's the one spot on the actual sewing itself that, like I said, I'm a little bit just curious to see how well that holds up over time. I don't think it's going to be kind of a structural or functional issue. It's more of just maybe one of those things where every now and then I'm clipping off like a loose fraying thread type of thing. You got reflective threads in there on the inside of those bridge loops, which if you got a fixed bridge, not a big deal there. But if you have one of the bridge types that allows you to have that carabiner to clip in, could be an advantage to having that reflective thread there. On the inside of those Lymans loops, you do have reflective threading as well. And because they're a little bit further forward, they got the reflective threading. Most likely if you're climbing with the usage of a headlamp, you're going to be able to look down in there and see a little reflective thread to make it a little bit easier for you. One other comparison with kind of the original Kestrel versus this Kestrel Flex. Here's the original back band that came with my Kestrel. Fairly thick, stiff, kind of bulky, doesn't really fold up well. On the new one, for the Flex, you can see maybe 2/3 of the width and a much more flexible, pliable material. So it's able to pack down a lot tighter of a profile than this original one was. So I think they made a big improvement with this here. Now, little Prusik loops for the bridge. They didn't come with these O-rings initially. What I did is I added O-rings, kind of like what Tethered has on theirs, just to be able to make it so that if I don't have these connected, I don't have to worry about these Prusik loops on the bridge coming undone and kind of falling off and losing them. You do have metal closures here. Also, one other thing to note is that this type of system, basically where you have the carabiner, the Prusik Tender, and the Prusik itself with these sewn eyes, basically you're going to have that on the bridge if you choose to get this style of bridge. You're also going to get it on the Lymans Rope, like I showed earlier, and you're going to get it on the tether. So that's just something to keep in mind. Adds a little bit of bulk there, but really not much. And I would say it's probably least necessary on the tether, most necessary on the Lymans Rope, and kind of nice to have on the bridge. That said, the fact that they offer them on all three is kind of nice. In my opinion, I'm always going to like a splice over having this being, let's say, like a knot, for example. And these, unlike what you would see maybe more typically in the arborist industry where they would have like a micro pulley here, additional metal, I like the fact that they just have these plastic rings with that webbing here to eliminate additional potential for metal-to-metal noise. So it's a nice way of doing it, I think, in my opinion. A little bit more bulky than a mechanical ascender, but easier to use than if this thing weren't here. And so I think definitely a lot of people are going to find that as an improvement over just the basic system that they used to have. In my opinion, the Lymans Rope is way longer than it needs to be. It doesn't necessarily hurt you to have too long of a Lymans Rope. It just is a little bit more material when you're folding it up, a little bit heavier. And that said, if you find that the Lymans Rope is a little bit longer than you really need, you can always shorten it, but you can't make it longer. So just keep that in mind if you do want to cut it down. In terms of movement and shot opportunities around the tree, there's not going to be really major differences between the Flex and any of the other minimalist saddle systems on the market. I'm personally a platform guy, so on a tree this size, this is about the biggest type of tree that I would hunt with a platform all by itself. You get any bigger than this, and I'd like to add a little strap with a step on the back side of the tree to be able to push off and leverage against. And if you're a ring of steps guy, then a tree this size would typically work too. But with this saddle or any other ones, if I'm running a ring of steps, I'd usually have that tether a little bit higher up with that longer length so that I can walk around the tree a little bit easier. Whereas with the platform, I like this set up a little bit lower. And oftentimes what I'll do too is I can take this thing and shorten it up even more. Like if I know it's getting close to prime time or something, and I don't mind, necessarily standing still for a little while, and I don't have quite as much weight on my saddle. It's a little bit more weight on my legs, but it's not that big of a deal. I typically like to hunt like this a little bit more, because then I can use that platform to be able to rotate in place and be able to do things like stand like this to get shots like that on my weak side, which for me is typically a little bit easier and less movement than trying to walk around the backside of the tree and leverage off. So just something to play around with and something to think about. From this position here too, there's not enough slack in my tether that if I were to fall here, it would really do anything in terms of damaging the rope or being able to create a large shock load or anything like that. So I'll just kind of demonstrate that quick. Right, that's about the biggest drop I'm gonna get. So in summary, I guess, what are my thoughts on the Flex? In terms of the comfort, because this is one of the big things that we're trying to really tackle with the Flex, was not only to kind of increase the comfort, but also make it easier for new saddle hunters to be able to figure it out, as opposed to knowing exactly what levers to pull and what exactly you need to do if you are getting something like the saddle riding up your backside. And I gotta say, it is a very comfortable saddle. It's pretty easy to just put it on, get in the tree, get it figured out. I think for people that don't have a lot of experience with saddle hunting, I think it's gonna be pretty easy for them to take it out of the box, get it on the tree, and be able to find that initial comfort. It is, one of the more heavy options in terms of the minimalist saddle selections. In this particular model, there is a lot of metal with the various carabiners and things like that. So these are all things that you're just gonna need to weigh for what your goals are, what you're looking for within a saddle. Are you a true minimalist? Are you hunting in really hot southern climates all the time, or does your season not start till October 1st and maybe you're in Michigan? That can play into one way versus the other. It is nice that they have the reflective material inside the Lymans ropes. It is nice that they offer the 3 different bridge options. If it were me, I personally would go with the fixed webbing bridge, not this the rope bridge that I actually chose to be able to get in this saddle for the review. Reason for it, I wanted to get the rope bridge to be able to test it out, see how well it functioned as a secondary Lymans rope. But what a lot of people find when they start saddle hunting is they experiment a lot when they're first starting out. Figure out what bridge height or what bridge length works best for them, what tether height works best for them, and then eventually they end up finding a system that they can just go back to and they just use over and over and over and just keep going back to it. And a lot of times you'll hear people say that maybe they started with an adjustable bridge and they wound up with just a fixed bridge and it works fine for them. And so from that perspective, I'm kind of in the same boat. I would be totally fine having just kind of a fixed webbing on one side, webbing on the other side, and just adjust that webbing to where it was comfortable for me and just running with it. But that might not be the case for everybody. So it's nice that they have the option. And like I said a couple times earlier, if you wanted to use that as kind of a temporary secondary hookup point while you're going up the tree, you do have that option. Another thing that I really think they made a big improvement on was the back band. They did a really good job at eliminating the bulk and kind of the stiffness of that back band, and just overall, made this thing a lot more user-friendly, I think, in my opinion. I'd like to see these connections be maybe a non-metal connection, just from the noise aspect. But again, I think with all of the stuff that's on here, regardless of how much metal there is, if you're careful, you can do it quietly, or you can tape the carabiners right. There's options. If you say, I like everything about the saddle, but there's a lot of metal there, and that's preventing you from making the decision, I wouldn't say that is the biggest deal, because I think you can work around those things. I'll just throw out a scenario. Let's say you got a kite and you've been using that kite, you love the kite, and it works well for the conditions that you hunt in, and you're able to hunt out of it comfortably. I don't know that there would be a huge benefit to upgrading to the Flex. Whereas on the other hand, maybe you're the type of guy who you had a Kestrel or something, and you tried it out and you just never quite could get it right. You'd struggle with hip pinch, you get it figured out, the saddle be riding up, you couldn't quite get it figured out, and you're just kind of struggled finding that optimal comfort. I think this would be something that you might be able to benefit from, just because of the way it's designed. So ultimately, again, I think we're in a really good time for saddle hunting and saddle hunters, because there's a lot of options. A lot of items are on back order right now, just because of the huge demand that saddle hunting has right now. So you can really have your pick of options and try to determine what is, the best for your scenario. So I hope that the information that I had in this video will help you make that decision on, what the right saddle is for you, whether you want to upgrade to the Flex, whether you want to buy a Flex as your first saddle, or whether you want to go with a different option. So that'll do it for this video. If you guys have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. Also, if you're looking for more information about the Flex, I've seen there's a few other YouTube reviews already out already. Bobby and I actually did a podcast back when this thing was first being released, and you can find that podcast on the Sportsman's Nation podcast network under the DIY Sportsman feed. And with that, thanks for watching.